How's it going? My name is Jess and this is Reason. Today I'm joined with Jake Scott, the chairman of the Mallard, and we will be discussing the need to defend childhood. This is based on Jake's article for The Critic, which I highly recommend you check out. In this video, we will be discussing the rising anti-natalist sentiment in society, the attempt to remove childhood innocence, and how to address and combat this issue. Let's start the conversation. So, why do you think childhood should be protected?
The thing that people often forget when it comes to childhood is it's a uniquely vulnerable period in your life. Right? We can talk about vulnerability. People are vulnerable at different times in their life. People can be retired, they can be pensioners, they can be old, they can be vulnerable by circumstance of the time of day, the location, so on and so forth. But the unique vulnerability of childhood is that you've never known anything else. That's what makes childhood so special. It's a real period in your life that is totally dependent on your parents, others as well, parents primarily. It's a period of, as I say, complete dependency, but also a certain degree of wonder. Right? Children naturally are amazed by the world. They find the world interesting. They find the world magical. They believe things that we as parents, as adults, consider to be, be below us, and really is a wonderful period in life. But like I say, that dependency implies a serious duty on the part of the parents to protect and to educate children properly. And that's the key thing when it comes to childhood. Is not necessarily education in the sense of transferring knowledge, but education in the sense of even teaching children how to learn, right? So it's not just a case of, as I say, transferring knowledge from one generation to the next. It's a case of recognizing that authority exists to protect yourself, to protect you, and that experiences are passed down because they're practically valuable, not just because they serve some kind of social purpose, but they're practically valuable. So, to summarize, I suppose, children need protecting because they are uniquely vulnerable. They don't know anything else, and the duty of parenthood is to teach children how to even learn in the first instance.
It seems like such an obvious statement that we need to protect children and childhood, but over the past few decades we've seen a rise of threats like Drag Queen Story Hour, where drag queens have gone into libraries where there are kids, young kids, and reading stories to them. And when you question this, when you challenge this, they often say, oh, we're just dressing up and reading stories to children. And so you need to understand why childhood is so important. So I think that's why the question and the answer is so important. But on the topic of threats, what do you think the threats are that have come about over the past few decades? And why is this such an important issue?
The threats are uniquely political. They are people who see children, rightly see children, as malleable. Children are malleable. They are, as I said, vulnerable. They're yet to even learn how to learn. But they see them almost as petri dishes for their experimental political ideologies. And that's, for one thing, that's inhumane. One of the great victories of Enlightenment philosophy was Kant's categorical imperative that you do not treat other people as means to an end. You treat them as ends in themselves. And to treat children as experiments for political goals is deeply wrong. So that's why this is so dangerous. As to why this has come about, there's been an abdication of moral guidance in the West. There's a really good book called Statecraft as Soulcraft by George Will, in which he points out that education is a moral act. And that's because you have to make a decision over which knowledge is practically useful and therefore relevant, right? Um, when it comes to children and education in general, we have attempted some kind of neutral attitude that all knowledge is equal. Not all knowledge is equal, right? All knowledge has a practical purpose. Of course it does. But knowing how to do something is not the same as knowing what to do, right? And this is why moral leadership matters so much. But because we've taken this kind of neutral attitude, or in many ways, we've as I say, we've kind of treated children as experiments for political projects. It's managed to sneak in this more insidious approach to uh, children's lives. Tony Blair would say, education, education, education. It's all about education. And he knew that because that was the way that you captured the next generation. And conservatives, or rightists in general, I suppose, have made the mistake of giving their enemies the benefit of the doubt, of resting on a few false presumptions, one of which is that you become more conservative as you age. It's actually empirically not true. There's a sort of typical presumption that as people grow up, they become conservative because they have things worth conserving. That's not necessarily true. You have to give people a reason to feel that the things they have are worth something, not just, accidental. So we've abandoned our moral duty when it comes to education. That has allowed for quite corrosive beliefs to come in under the guise of liberation, or under the guise of fighting discrimination. You know, there are reasonable arguments to make in terms of explaining why discrimination should be dealt with at a younger age rather than at an age when you know uh, people are not receptive to it. But I also think that's giving teenagers a bad rap, right? Teenagers are capable of understanding these things. So the idea that you can only do this at a young age is, I think, again, it's politically motivated, as opposed to, like you say, it kind of hides behind that idea of we're just doing X. Well, you're not just doing X. You're doing it in a specific way, and the way you're doing it is intentionally to sever the knowledge of that generation from the knowledge of the previous generation, right? If every generation in history, every single generation in history has known intuitively what a man or a woman is, and then you manage to inculcate into a generation this kind of critical attitude towards sex, that we can't know what a man or a woman is, then all of a sudden you do have this sort of possibility of a generational reset, of a chance to sever the connection between generations. That's fundamentally what leftism seeks to do. It's part of the reason that communist regimes, since the failed project of the Russian Revolution, have taken children from their parents and made them wards of the state, because they know that it's children that you have to capture.
How do you think we should fight against this?
The right has become paralytically scared of state action. It started to accept the dogma of Thatcherite economics, that the retreated state is the best approach, and started to take that principle to social attitudes. Right? That's why in the late 2000s and early 2010s, the right started to adopt socially liberal attitudes. It's not liberal in the sense of any political project. It's actually liberal in the sense of an absence of a political project, right? Because they believe that politics should not be involved in those things. But as I've said, political principles have to see things in a moral dimension. They have to have an ability to distinguish between things that are good and things that are bad. And places that are learning to undo this are Poland, Hungary, America, some states in America, of course, many other states are part of the problem. But Governor DeSantis in Florida is a perfect example of this. He's prepared to actually use the powers and levers of the state to expose what's being taught in schools and to shut schools down if they're exposing children to dangerous things. Likewise, in Texas, there's been a major move amongst parents, especially, to essentially recapture um, education boards. Right? Bearing in mind, in America, it's a highly democratized society in the sense that many, many public institutions are democratically elected. We don't have the same thing here. But that doesn't mean that we have to give up the fight. What that means is that we need to identify the levers of state that we could use. And, I'm sure you know, and I'm sure everyone who's watching this probably knows, I was a huge fan of Kemi Badenoch during the Tory leadership campaign. And she has regularly talked about the need for protecting children in education. And she's wasted not being Secretary of State for Education. She really should be Secretary of State for Education, if not Prime Minister herself. That's what we need to do. We need to stop thinking, how can we sign petitions, or how can we lobby this person or that person? No, we should be taking control of the institutions. Think back to 2016. That phrase, take back control, that was not just about Brexit. That was about a general sense that society had drifted away from control by the people who were shaped by that political system. So, yeah, we need to actually be prepared to use the thing that the right's become scared of, which is the state.
So, how do you think we should go about that directly in terms of policies, in terms of actions? What state power would you like to see?
Teachers are quite precious when it comes to their curricula. Right? They don't like parents getting involved. I completely sympathise with that. You have to, at a certain point, understand that some expertise or expert knowledge is necessary for these things to take place. But where things are being taught that are of social significance, there needs to be oversight. That means at every level, every educational level, primary, secondary, tertiary, university, everything. And for one thing, as a conservative government, we should not be trying to encourage LGBT education at primary level. That just means that we're complicit with the very problem that we're fighting against. So that needs to change. We need to, like I say, make oversight of curricula much more stringent when it comes to socially significant issues. But also fire teachers that do this sort of thing. I don't think that the problem is as prevalent as some people make it out to be. But where there are teachers who are intentionally teaching children falsehoods, like there are more than two genders, that needs to change. And things that are happening already, that Drag Queen Story Hour, again, it's not extraordinarily common, but we need to stop it where it is. Things like the family sex show, which cropped up over the summer, that needs to be wrenched out, and these bodies that create and fund these kinds of shows need to be not defunded. They need to be criminalized, right? They need to be closed down. They're insidious, they are dangerous, they're spreading falsehoods through society, and in the process they're sexualizing children, and as I've said in this, they're using children as experiments. That's fundamentally wrong.
Your answer surprises me a bit, because this is focused on the state rather than perhaps what I expected, more of a family approach. Do you think, why do you think family has withered away so much? Why do you think, for one, there are parents bringing their children to family sex shows and to Drag Queen Story Hour? Why are the parents actually taking an active role in this? And also, why do you not go straight to the family as the solution to stopping this?
Anti-natalist policies have meant that we as a society, have seen a declining birth rate. Um, well, actually, let me rephrase that. Antinatalist is one thing, but also I'd say like anatalist in the sense of an absence of policies on natalism. We need to. That it is a categorical truth that the state has an interest in families existing because families are, practically speaking, one of the most sufficient sources of welfare in history. Philosophically speaking, as I say, they're a place where children learn to become persons, right? And well, they begin their journey to becoming persons. Um, these sorts of things make it necessary for the state to be interested in the family's continued existence. But because, again, we've had this kind of, I suppose, squeamishness over the ability to morally distinguish between good families and bad families, has led us into a certain corner where we're unable to offer support to families that are good and unable to withdraw support from families that are bad. Instead, we end up with a bloated civil service that offers support to many people who don't deserve it, but also we end up creating things like child services that is essentially mopping up the problem caused by the state in the first place. So, take for instance the issue of single parenthood, which I'm probably going to get in hot water for saying this in a way, but it more often than not means single motherhood. But that's not to denigrate the mothers. As has been said multiple times, the mothers are the ones that stay. It's the fathers, the ones that abandon the children. Those are the people that need to be, stigmatized here, really. But nonetheless, there is a chronic problem of people seeing parenthood as optional, and it's not. Once you've made that commitment, that's a commitment for life. Sadly, for as long as either you or the child survives, but it is for life. And we have become, on a more philosophical note, we've become much more prepared to avoid choice, avoid proper choice. We've wanted to be able to make any choice we want at any time, but that means that we're not actually making choice. That means we're just sort of avoiding commitment, right? So to go back to this, we've been unable to actually support families. Really good paper came out by Civitas recently. I say really good. I contributed to it, so it couldn't be the best. But Charles Amos wrote for Civitas a paper in which he basically advocated for ending state support for families, because in his view, state support for families had ended up creating a welfare dependency culture. Now, I don't necessarily hold that to be true. I think that's mistaking the cause and effect. I think we've had the rise of a dependency culture and a family breakdown culture, and instead the state has tried to step in and play the role of one of the parents or both of the parents, and it shouldn't. Right? The state should help parents, and it should punish parents where they don't fulfill their duties. In terms of rolling this back or changing things, again, you have to look at countries like Hungary and Poland, where they've pursued pro-natalist policies that have actually. So Hungary hasn't managed to increase its birth rate, but it's at least managed to stop the decline. Right? It's gone from being in nosedive to basically being stable. That's remarkable. Nobody in the West has really tried that in the last 70 years. And again, part of the reason nobody's tried that is because they're scared of being called Hitler. They've been scared of being called fascist. There are countries that have pro-natalist policies that are very similar. Finland, Japan's definitely had to introduce pro-natalist policies. But the intentional the intention behind Hungary's policy was to increase native birth rates, to wean the country off immigration, and that's a problem in itself. We've become dependent on immigration, to the point where when you talk about immigration policies, you inevitably have someone say, well, "Who's going to work in the NHS?" So, well, if we're dependent on immigration to that extent, then maybe there is a problem, you know. So yeah, to go back to your question, we've abandoned our moral principles on distinguishing between good and bad families, but that also means that we've been unable to distinguish between people who deserve help and people who don't.
You mentioned cause and effect, that families have become dependent on the state due to culture. So, why do you think the solution is statism first, rather than cultural, rather than a more grassroots approach?
Well, I think it's a good question, but my response would be, why does it have to be one or the other? The issue lies in the fact that we don't have either, right? People in this country are apathetic towards family life. They don't necessarily, I mean, I don't have the statistics to back this up, but my intuition is that people in this country have forgotten the value of family. And likewise, the right has become scared of using the state. It absolutely should be both, right? It can't be one or the other. It has to be both. And the reason it has to be both is the powers of the state. If they're not going to be used by you, they're going to be used by someone else, right? People forget this. The state is not a neutral entity, no matter how big it is. If it's big, small, whatever, it's not neutral. It needs to be used by you. And likewise, in the grassroots, you have to try and influence the public conversation, because if you don't, someone else will. So all it comes down to, people forget this in politics. People think it's as simple as, oh, we'll just let forces work themselves out. Okay, but you need to be a force. You can't just. People talk about the battlefield of ideas, the marketplace of ideas. Okay, sure, but you have to be in there. You have to be generating those ideas and being prepared to propagate them. Otherwise, you're going to be excluded from the conversation altogether. So, yeah, that would be my answer. Is it has to be both.
Where do you think this disintegration of the families come from on a cultural and societal level? Where do you think that's come from? And how do you think we should fight back also on a societal level?
Absolutely, we should fight back on a societal level. As I said, we can't abandon that battlefield. Unfortunately, politics is a contest. It does have to be fought. It does have to be won. It doesn't end. It never ends. Politics is about winning, but it's not about having won and then going home. Um, how it happened and where it came from is a very good question. My opinion on this is that the beginning was the permissive society of the 1960s, because it created a world in which commitment was seen as antithetical to freedom, right? Really good book by Jacob Phillips recently called Obedience is Freedom, in which he made I would say, quite Hegelian argument that it is your willingness and your ability to commit to the world that gives you freedom, rather than your freedom being taken away. There was that recent discussion or policy floated by a minister. I don't think we know which minister it was, but a minister, in terms of essentially giving tax cuts to parents that have children, or to couples that have children. Some of the responses to that were telling, in that a lot of people seemed to think that a child is a burden, always. I'm not saying that it is. A child's a miracle, but these responses were basically, this is going to stop women working. Well, no, because a lot of women can have children in their 20s and go on to have very fulfilling careers in their 30s. And likewise, in the reverse, a lot of women can have very fulfilling careers in their 20s and then in their 30s decide to have children. A lot of women decide not to have children. A lot of women decide not to have careers. This was not an attempt to denigrate other choices, but it was an attempt. I think it was an admirable attempt and a noble attempt to reintroduce the moral imperative behind families and states being connected. And like I say, the what's the best way of phrasing this? The origin of this was in the inability to understand commitment properly. Commitment to a thing gives us identity, and at the end of the day, you have to commit to something eventually, right? And people do this in their lives. They commit to a career choice, they commit to a tattoo, they commit to trivial things, they commit to significant things. So clearly the problem is not commitment. Clearly the problem is what we think commitment's role is in our lives. And for many people, quite obviously, commitment is an obstacle to freedom rather than a source of it.